What's up, Wrestle Scope faithful? And if you're new here, strap in, because what I'm about to tell you is going to shatter everything you thought you knew about the current state of professional wrestling. Jon Moxley has finally broken his silence as AEW World Champion, and what he said will send shockwaves through the entire industry. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. While Moxley was making his declaration of war in AEW, his former brother, Seth Rollins, just unleashed the monster among men, Braun Strowman, on Monday Night Raw in what can only be described as a direct message to the Death Rider himself. The timing? Too perfect to be a coincidence. The implications? Absolutely catastrophic for the wrestling world as we know it. Hello viewers, if you're new here, please don't forget to like and hit the subscribe button for daily updates on WWE Raw. The Champion's Declaration. Let me paint you the picture of what just went down, and trust me, you're going to want to grab your phone and start commenting because this is wild. Jon Moxley stood in that AEW ring, the World Championship draped over his shoulder like the crown of a king who's conquered every kingdom in his path, and he didn't just speak, he preached. This wasn't your typical championship promo. This wasn't your cookie-cutter, I'm the best speech. This was a man possessed, a champion with a message, and that message was clear. AEW is his territory, and he's not just defending a championship, he's defending a philosophy. Now, let's break down exactly what Moxley said because the mainstream wrestling media is completely missing the point. While everyone else is focused on his words about the AEW roster, about his challengers, about his reign, I'm here to tell you that there was a subtext, a deeper meaning that connects directly to what's happening over in WWE. Moxley talked about brothers who lost their way. He talked about empires built on compromise. He talked about men who traded their souls for security. Now tell me, Wrestle Scope family, who does that sound like? Drop your answers in the comments right now because I know you're thinking what I'm thinking. The Death Rider didn't just break his silence as champion, he threw down a philosophical gauntlet. He basically said, I took the hard road, I built my legacy on my terms, and I'm standing here as the true world champion of professional wrestling. That's not just confidence, that's a declaration of war against everyone who chose differently. And here's what makes this absolutely maddening. Moxley specifically referenced his time in the old world, his time before liberation, his time when he was just another soldier in someone else's army. He didn't have to say the 3 letters. He didn't have to mention the company name. We all know what he was talking about. And more importantly, they know what he was talking about. The AEW champion essentially looked into that camera and said, I left the biggest wrestling company in the world and I became more than I ever could have been there. That's not shade. That's a nuclear bomb dropped right on Stamford, Connecticut's front lawn. But wait, it gets better. Moxley then went on to say something that's been completely overlooked by every single wrestling news outlet I've seen. He said, and I quote, some men need monsters to hide behind. Some men need to unleash chaos because they can't create it themselves. I am the chaos. I am the monster, and I don't need anyone to fight my battles. When I heard that, my jaw dropped because at that exact moment, over on Monday Night Raw, but we'll get to that in a second. First, smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell because this story is developing and you need to be here when the next chapter drops. The Monster Unleashed. Now let's flip the script and head over to Monday Night Raw, where Seth freaking Rollins just pulled off one of the most controversial moves of his entire career. The visionary, the revolutionary, the architect, whatever you want to call him, just made a statement that's reverberating through every locker room in professional wrestling. Seth Rollins, in a moment of what can only be described as calculated chaos, unleashed Braun Strowman on the Raw roster like a weapon of mass destruction. But here's where this gets interesting, and I need you all to comment below if you caught this too. The way Rollins did this, the words he used, the entire presentation of this moment was dripping with subtext aimed at one man and one man only, Jon Moxley. Rollins stood in that ring and talked about needing the right tools for the job. He talked about evolution. He talked about using every resource available to maintain dominance in WWE. And then he brought out the monster among men, 6 foot 8 inches, 385 pounds of controlled destruction, and essentially said, this is what power looks like in WWE. This is what happens when you have the resources of the biggest wrestling company in the world behind you. Now, am I saying Seth Rollins was directly responding to Jon Moxley? Well, let's look at the facts, people. Let's examine the evidence that the wrestling world is ignoring. Fact number 1, the timing. Moxley makes his first major promo as AEW champion, and within the same week, Rollins makes this massive power move on Raw.
Coincidence? I don't think so. Fact number 2, the language. Both men used almost mirror terminology. Moxley talks about not needing anyone to fight his battles. Rollins brings out a literal giant to fight his. Moxley talks about being his own monster. Rollins literally unleashes the monster among men. This is chess, people. This is psychological warfare being played out on international television. Fact number 3, the history. We cannot forget that Seth Rollins and Jon Moxley were brothers. They were part of the most dominant faction in modern wrestling history, the Shield. They bled together, they conquered together, they changed the business together. And then, Moxley left. He walked away from WWE, walked away from everything they built, and essentially said, I don't need this empire. I'll build my own. Do you really think Seth Rollins doesn't think about that every single day? Do you really believe that the competitive fire that burns in the visionary doesn't spark every time he sees Moxley succeeding outside of WWE? Drop a comment if you think there's real heat between these former brothers. And let's talk about Braun Strowman for a second, because this choice is deliberate. Rollins didn't align with just anyone. He didn't bring out a technical master. He didn't bring out a high flyer. He brought out the one man who represents raw power, unchecked aggression, and unstoppable force. This is Seth Rollins saying, you want to be the tough guy, Mox? You want to be the hard man who does things his way? Let me show you what real power looks like when it's backed by the machine you walked away from. The disrespect, the audacity, and you know what? I'm here for it. This is the kind of cross-promotional tension that makes wrestling must-see television. This is why we're all still watching. Hit that like button if you want to see where this goes. The Shield Shadow. We need to address the elephant in the room, Wrestle Scope family, and that elephant is wearing tactical gear and carrying a legacy that still influences professional wrestling to this very day. The Shield, 3 letters that changed everything. Jon Moxley, then Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns revolutionized WWE. They came through the crowd like invaders, they destroyed everything in their path, and they forced the entire industry to adapt to their style of warfare. They were brothers in arms, united by a common cause, bonded by blood and battle. And then it all fell apart. Seth betrayed the group first. We all remember that infamous chair shot, that iconic moment that redefined villainy in WWE. But the Brotherhood eventually reformed, wounds healed, and we all thought that the Shield was eternal. But then, Moxley left. And not just left, he escaped. He walked away from WWE and never looked back. He went to NJPW, he went to the independent scene, and then he became the centerpiece of All Elite Wrestling. He didn't just leave a company, he left a family. Now, Seth and Roman stayed. They became the faces of WWE. Roman Reigns dominated as the tribal chief for over 1,300 days. Seth Rollins became the workhorse, the fighting champion, the revolutionary who carried Raw on his back. They chose loyalty to WWE. They chose the empire. But here's the question that's eating away at both of these men, the question that nobody is asking. Who made the right choice? Jon Moxley is standing in AEW as the world champion, having arguably the best matches of his entire career, working a schedule he controls, saying whatever he wants and living as the most authentic version of himself. He's not reading scripts, he's not following corporate mandates, he is professional wrestling in its purest, most dangerous form. Meanwhile, Seth Rollins has had an incredible WWE career, don't get me wrong, multiple world championships, WrestleMania main events, legendary matches. But there's always been that question, that shadow. What if Seth had left too? What could he have become outside the WWE system? And that's why this matters. That's why Rollins unleashing Strowman feels like more than just a storyline. This feels personal. This feels like Seth saying, you think you're free, Mox? You think you're the real champion? Let me show you what I've built while you were playing Rebel. The psychological warfare here is next level. Comment below if you think this rivalry is real or if I'm reading too much into this. But before you do, think about every interview both men have done. Think about how they carefully avoid directly mentioning each other. That's not coincidence, that's loaded silence. And here's something that should terrify the wrestling world. What happens if these two ever meet again? What happens if, and I know this is fantasy booking, but what happens if circumstances align and Jon Moxley and Seth Rollins end up in the same ring on the same show at the same event? The wrestling world would explode. Social media would melt down because this isn't just a match. This would be a reckoning. This would be brother versus brother, loyalty versus freedom, empire versus rebellion, the establishment versus the outlaw. Make sure you're subscribed because if this ever happens, Wrestle Scope is going to break it down first and break it down right. The power dynamics. Let's talk about something the wrestling media refuses to address honestly, the power dynamics of modern professional wrestling. Jon Moxley represents one model of success, independence, creative freedom, and building a legacy on your own terms. He walked away from the guaranteed money, the global platform, the mainstream exposure of WWE, and he bet on himself. And that bet has paid off in ways that have validated every single wrestler who's ever felt restricted by the traditional system. Seth Rollins represents the other model, working within the system, becoming indispensable to the machine, and using that platform to achieve heights that are impossible anywhere else. WrestleMania main events, stadium shows, global merchandise sales, international media appearances. Seth has achieved things that AEW simply cannot offer, at least not yet. So who's right? Who wins this philosophical debate? And that's exactly why Rollins unleashing Braun Strowman is such a power move. He's essentially saying, you have freedom, Mox? Cool. I have resources. I have the backing of $1 billion company. I can make strategic alliances. I can build armies. Moxley fights alone because that's his identity. He's the lone wolf, the outlaw, the man who doesn't need backup. But Rollins is reminding everyone that there's power in partnership. There's strength in having the biggest wrestling company in the world behind you. This is a clash of philosophies playing out in real time. This is the